Hello and welcome back to another episode of the War Report, our first episode since the Vilnius summit. Hell of a week for scheduling conflicts, let me tell you. It always seems to be the worst ones possible for something like this to happen. But we're back. We have plenty to cover. I will warn you because of everything that has happened over the past few weeks, some things will be glossed over, some things will be completely omitted. That's not because I forgot about them or I'm avoiding talking about them, but after a certain point, you have to weigh, you have to pick and choose what seems to be most important. And I'll try to cover these stories as pertinent in future episodes, but unfortunately, given the time constraints and given the amount of news, there are some tough decisions I had to make. So, if there's anything that you think was really important that I missed, like just let me know. I'll look into it. I'll try to get it in future episodes. But without further ado, I think you should give us a brief update on the front in
Yeah,
Ukraine.
yeah, and I will say I'm also sorry that we couldn't come up with a with an episode. I have been sick with some kind of an infection since Thursday of last week. Today is just like the first like day where I feel normal again. So, anyways, yeah, so I'll give you guys the update, the minutia minute this time, because there's really so much that has happened that is more than the front line, although that has been extremely active. Fighting has been very brutal, and casualties high on both sides. So, with no further ado, I'll begin, and we'll begin in the west of the country, the southwest pocket. And that is since the last show, there have been constant daily strikes, both on Odessa and the ports in and around Odessa. But I think what was really striking yesterday was an attack that happened in the absolute most southern section of Ukraine, an area that borders around Romania. Two strikes on the south side of the Danube River, and they have taken out basically where munitions and other important supplies for Ukraine's military effort have been stored. Depending on the angle, the missiles might, they didn't, but if they were launched from a southerly direction, they would have had to probably fly over Romanian territory for a brief moment before they hit their targets. In any case, it's very bold because one of the strikes is just 20 kilometers away from the Romanian border. Strikes on Snake Island have been continuing. In the Kherson offensive, the Ukrainians have not managed to expand their bridgehead by the bridge that was recently blown up. Not the dam. This is the bridge in Kherson, not too far from that area. So that's been kind of quiet the last few days. There were, of course, strikes on Sevastopol. The vast majority of dozens and dozens of drones have been shot down. One drone did get through, two drones actually, since the last show, have gotten through. One of them hit an ammo depot. The other actually killed a girl that was talking to her mom on the phone as she was walking somewhere along the beach in Sevastopol. And I should mention that besides the granaries that have been targeted by the Russians and the ports themselves, also oil depots have been taken out. Um, Still remaining more or less in the west, central west area of Ukraine. We go further north, massive airstrikes today. Kinjals were used, no less than four waves of strikes. Airfields where the Storm Shadow missiles have been launched from have been destroyed. At least three airstrips have been hit, including one in Zhytomyr and Khmelnytsky, and I believe one around Vinnytsia. In any case, that is where the strikes have been going on. And now we move to the Zaporozhye front. Um, More fighting around Piatihatki. Ukraine, since the last we spoke, has basically secured Piatihatki and most of the force belt around it on its southwestern flank, but they have not been able to enter any other villages through there. Um, Yesterday saw an effort that didn't go anywhere. There was a massive attack in the Orechov area um, in order to try to capture Robotino, and they went slightly east of the city and or town. I mean, this is a small town, but slightly east. Um, that and the attack was precluded by an airstrike, which set things off. Um, they've created a bit of a gray zone, but they have been pushed back. Three more um, Leopard 2A tanks have been destroyed. Weep Union did a video a couple of days ago about how many confirmed kills. And today there were, the last 2 days, I would say a total of three Leopard 2A tanks have been destroyed. And then from beginning from June 4th to, let's say, July 24th, 23rd, when that front line was also very, very active, um, we're now at roughly 31 to 32 destroyed Leopard 2A tanks, which is half the fleet that was sent to Ukraine. More Bradleys. Also, there are now many articles in Political, Washington Post, New York Times, all of them basically mentioning that in the first 2 weeks, Ukraine lost 20% of everything that it had been given. Implications that that also included manpower. And then in the 2 or 3 subsequent weeks, they lost another 10%. So we're saying that by the first week of July, 30% of men and material have been destroyed. Um, there has been a Ukrainian journalist that has now made the claim that over 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. I don't know that because if you do the math, like you can sort of figure out how many after 17 months could you fit 300,000. I don't know. I'm always skeptical about this.
Yes, and then there's
Uh,
always
uh,
the conflation of both casualties and actual deaths, whereas a casualty can be anyone who was removed from combat for any sort of reason, whether it be injury, whatever else. So there's always those conflations where a lot of people
yeah.
will think that casualty equals death when it could be a myriad of things. Now, I can believe that Ukraine has suffered 300,000 casualties, but in terms of 300,000 KIA, that is much more of a stretch.
Yes. Moving further west, further east in the Vremenovka area, more attempts in the last 24 hours to break through. Um, it was either in Orekhovo or the Vremensky Ledge, where up to 40 vehicles were used and several Bradleys were destroyed, at least 9 Soviet tanks as well that the Ukrainians used, like the T-64, some T-72s that were on loan, well, not on loan, that were gifted by Poland, Czech Republic, other former Soviet states. Ugledar has been fairly quiet. Marinka has been fairly quiet. The Russians managed to gain fire control over the one good road leading into Avdiivka, but they have not been able to tighten the hold more than that. Now we move to Bakhmut, where basically Ukraine's best performance has come about at a high cost, but the Russians defending the southern flank of Bakhmut and Klishayevka has also come at a very high cost. The Ukrainians have managed to take the stronghold above Klishayevka to the northwest of it. This is on higher ground. This is what makes defending Kleshevka very difficult. Also, because the road leading in to supply Kleshevka actually north, runs very close to Kleshevka as well. So now the Russians are in a situation that the Ukrainians were as they delivered supplies from Chasov Yar, essentially. Um, I saw a horrific video yesterday where, you know, at least 7 of 10 Russian soldiers, maybe all 10, were killed in an ambush. So this is what it's costing just to keep up this area uh, from collapsing. This is all on lower terrain, so if um, if the Ukrainians manage to create a bridgehead that starts to encircle Klishevka, indeed take over Klishevka, I honestly don't know how the Russians have managed to hold on to it. They're being very stubborn about it. Um, the Ukrainians also took some dachias in an area just on this, just bordering the southwestern section of Bakhmut. Their attacks around Solidar have been less successful, but at least today, not very successful. Yesterday, they managed to gain a little bit of territory. And then we move basically in the Liman, Kremenaya, Svatove, and Kupiansk direction. And since the last show, the Russians made a lot of gains in the Sherwood Forest area, drawing ever closer towards Liman, or as the Russians called it, Krasny Liman. And the Ukrainians were forced to send some reserves, including reserves from Zaporozhye. Then what happened yesterday and today, quite a bit of gains outside of Svatove. The Russian line of defense was in a valley. So to gain all this territory, they had to go through heights. And they've managed to press about 6 to 7 kilometers. They have crossed the Zherebets River. And in the Kupiansk area, since the last show, they've made gains around there. I believe they are now on the outskirts of a town called Sinovke. So that's the front line right now. Very small gains by the Ukrainians in the Zaporozhye front. More and more articles talking about how difficult it is. And for political reasons, I think that the Ukrainians are pressing for Bakhmut because it's the territory that it's the last one that the Russians have got, and if the Ukrainians are able to retake it, because remember, General Syrskyi has said this is a personal matter. We lost a lot of men there. It's important for us to take it. Now, the west side of Bakhmut or Artemyevsk is a huge agglomeration of settlements. You've got Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. This is a big area, much, much bigger than Bakhmut itself. It is a very strong line of defense, but basically, they're going for Bakhmut to demoralize the Russian public. They're counting on the whole Prigozhin episode as a way to sow doubt in the Russian public's mind.
It's also a
Uh,
great play for the media-addled Western sponsors because
yes,
if Washington, Brussels, etc., can take this home, takes it to CNN, the BBC, whatever network you want to put in there, and say the plucky Ukrainian freedom fighters have redeemed themselves after the evil Russian victory, that plays not to even a majority of the population, but enough of the politically aware population where they're willing to sign on to their government sending billions upon billions more aid. I mean, you just look at the aid package that came out over the course of these past 2 weeks. I'll get into those in a little bit when we get into some stuff about Odessa. But not only it's threefold. You demoralize the Russians by having this hard-fought battle, the results of it effectively reversed. For the Ukrainians, this area that was understood to be a meat grinder, that was a certain death sentence even being deployed to that front, has been redeemed. And then, thirdly, as I said before, when it comes to those fueling the Ukrainian war effort, it plays well to the press and it plays well to their sponsors. Which, when
Right.
you look at just the counteroffensive in general, the main people they are trying to evoke a reaction out of in general, I would say even more than demoralizing the Russians, is they are still trying to convince their Western sponsors that this is a war effort worth supporting, that this is something worth sinking billions upon billions of more dollars and resources into, even after everything that has happened over the past 17, almost 18 months at this point. So that's
Right.
one major thing that I think a lot of people overlook when analyzing the broad spring summer counteroffensive. That the main people who need to be impressed here are the people in Washington, the people in London, the people in Brussels, etc.
Right. And the consensus now, um, I've seen one woman in an interview for CNN. She pops up on CSIS from time to time. And basically, she was dismayed that it seems now that there's been a role reversal between Germany and America. And that is, well, Germany was lagging in support and showed hesitancy. It is now that the Americans that are doing that. There's articles that are there's a consensus building that that is the case. She
And
also brought up the elections in 2024. Um, I should also say that there are more and more articles that have been popping up. Again, Washington Post, New York Times, Political, CNN articles, um, Forbes, whatever, and they're talking about morale is low right now in the Ukrainian army. They need something. And this is, I think, like Bakhmut would be a way to demoralize the Russian public and lift the morale of the Ukrainians. Um,
and there's
but
one
there's
thing I
there's
do want to add in terms of Western machinations in regard to the Ukraine war. Some news that I saw recently that depending on who you are, could be considered concerning. It's somewhat concerning to me. So there were reports that, well, it's confirmed that Victoria Nuland, the architect of the Maidan, is now the Undersecretary of State, second to the Secretary of
yes,
State, second to Blinken. Now, some people might think that's just a position, it's just a warm body waiting in the wings for anything to ever happen to the Secretary of State. What you have to realize is, with the way these bureaucracies work, especially on the federal level, tasks are constantly delegated downstream. So you have, of course, the executive, the top guy, Joe Biden, is coherent as he may or may not be. Sets a general plan, throws it out to his underlings. That being Blinken, Blinken throws it out to his underlings. Well, the next direct one is Victoria Nuland. So while Blinken goes around doing the high level Secretary of State work, going to all the stupid meetings and summits, etc., you have somebody like Victoria Nuland, who once again is infamous, arguably the architect of this entire war going all the way back to
yep,
2013, if not even earlier than that, is
yep,
now second to the Secretary of State. Not that she was ever not influential in this administration, especially in its foreign policy. Hell, I thought she was going to be either Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. I'm surprised Susan Rice also wasn't included in the administration, but she has scandal of her own under her. But I mean, to a much lesser degree, she was also involved in a lot of this nonsense. But she was more responsible for the disasters in Libya and Syria. But that's getting too much into the weeds on
yeah,
this. But
yeah. She replaced Sherman, if I'm not mistaken.
correct. But moving somebody like Newland up one rung on the ladder, so to speak, is, to me at least, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this, concerning on the direction that the U.S. is looking to take in regard to this war.
Right. So even though America is saying we're not going to send you ATACMS, Europe will have to provide the F-16s as well as training. Still no word about the Abrams tanks. While that's going on, you're right, and I'm so glad you brought it up. Bringing Victoria Nuland closer to the forefront of this war tends to suggest the opposite. and I'm sure that that has not escaped the notice of the Russians. Hello?
Yeah, I thought you had more to add to that, but uh,
No, that's it.
yeah, I would agree. It certainly has not escaped the notice of the Russians. And look, I don't think she's going to replace Blinken because, of course, Blinken has more responsibilities than just the Ukraine
Yeah.
war. There's the burgeoning conflict with China. There's whatever the hell is happening in the Middle East, whatever you want to term that. I guess you could say the Chinese supplanting of American hegemony in the Middle East is a good description of what's going on right now, especially with the ongoing Saudi-Iranian negotiations. But there's so many other factors to consider. I don't think Newland is somebody who's ever going to be in that position because she's too of a one-track mind. I mean, look, we all know with her ethno-religious background, has a certain grudge against the Russians. I mean, so does Blinken, but I would say to much lesser extent. Newland has really seemed to embrace that. So she has a very one-track mind about the Ukraine war that I think will pursue that. And I'm just going to say, as a general barometer, the more you hear from her and about her, the worse Ukraine is going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know what are they going to do. It, it it certainly strikes a little bit of foreboding for me, right? Because she's crazy. She thought, I think she thought in 2013 and 2014 that they would get Crimea. I personally believe that.
I just had a very disturbing thought that I feel that I need to share with the audience regarding this. Do you think if we get the situation like where it's Hell World and Ukraine wins and Russia completely collapses, that we'll get like how the Albanians started naming their kids like Tony Blair, that we'll get like some sort of
Mm.
Biden equivalent of that in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think that that's already kind of happened,
Really?
right? I mean,
I
well,
would.
they've named some of the kids Javelin.
Oh, so.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh.
yeah. Early on, that's like 2022.
Oh, I remember that now. But I,
Joe
I,
Biden, Joe Biden
I,
is a first name.
I don't know.
That's
I
happened.
don't think anything will ever be as cursed as the Albanians named Tony Blair, but that's just me personally. Man, that's these are the stakes of a Western victory. I hope you all
They
understand that.
idolize Americans, right? And you can see why like Americans love being idolized. It's why they have like this admiration for the Poles, right? Because they just feed off of it. I saw an interview with an American mercenary that was fighting in Ukraine and had come back, and he was in a subunit of Azov. Of course, he was surprised by like all the Nazi paraphernalia. One member actually, I'm going to deduce that he was Jewish because he had just come back from Israel and had gotten not terribly upset, but a little bit upset when one of the guys was Zeke Kiley. And what he said was that they idolize us, our weaponry, everything. Um, so I mean, it's pretty sad.
It's
Um,
completely cartoonish. I'll just put it this way in terms of the way these people view America. Everything that you've heard about all the supposed pro-Russia people in the West, how they just kiss Russia's feet, whatever. Look, not that I'm saying those people. I mean, look, a few of them probably exist, but certainly not to any great numbers. But everything they say about those kind of people, the inverse, when you do a mirror image of that, however you want to put it, those types who view America that way in places like Ukraine, Poland, that's actually an understatement of the way like they view America. It's
yeah,
it's slavish. And look, these people are the assuming you have some stake, some interest in the American Empire for whatever reason that might be. I don't think anyone watching this program probably does at this point. That's why you're here. Welcome. But I mean, they're an excellent fifth column. You couldn't ask for better cannon fodder, so to speak. At least
hmm
if I'm looking at this purely objectively from the point of view of Washington, these
yeah.
people are a godsend.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, people have made comparisons with like ISIS and the Taliban and all that, but these guys, not the Taliban, sorry, the Mujahideen from the 80s.
Yeah, yeah, big
Um,
difference.
yeah, I mean, of course, the Taliban was a branch that broke off from them and so on. That's another thing altogether. But um, yeah, this level of simping and idolization is through the roof, and really all of that was established by many of the secret channels that were maintained right after World War II. Um, yeah, but we were talking about Odessa and all the strikes that have been going on there. I don't know, like if you want to talk about, potentially um, the potential for a new Russian strategy in that area,
Well, I think that
or
will
and
play more into just the entire situation in the Black Sea, Russian-Turkish relations, and the
yeah, the
fallout of the
grain deal
grain
is a
deal.
big deal.
Yeah, and actually some of the after effects of the grain deal with what Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, I think also Bulgaria was in on that as well, where they have leaned on the European Union to extend its ban on Ukrainian grain imports. But I'll get into that in just a moment. But after the grain deal fell through, I believe the date on that was it was I think July 14th, if I'm remembering correctly, where everything just fell through. It was days after the Vilnius summit,
Yes.
and many people were speculating that as of July 20th, because that's the date the Russians gave, July 20th, midnight local time, that the Russians would consider any ships that weren't Russian, that any NATO aligned ships entering into the Black Sea would be considered carrying weapons and hostile. Now, so far we have not got any incidents of ships being attacked or sunk in the Black Sea, any merchant ships. And I don't think we will. I think people are missing the bigger picture on this. What we can look at with that is that, number one, nobody in the right mind is going to insure these ships. So shipping out of the Black Sea is just going to be completely shut down for the time being. Anything that is not Russian. It leans on Turkey because, of course, Turkey also having a major Black Sea coastline, very reliant on economically, arguably just as, if not more, than the Russians are in the Black Sea. But they will need to contend with much more dangerous waters there. It's going to become a no-go zone. Now, on the other hand, that's also perfect if you want to create a false flag, if you want to have a reason to justify further support for Ukraine, if not outright direct intervention against Russia. But the Black Sea has become untouchable. And really it's going to come down to naval might. From what I've seen so far, from what I've seen since the beginning of the war, the U.S. is not going to move. I mean, I'm talking beginning of the war since 2014, since the tensions rose, annexation of Crimea, etc. The U.S. is not going to move a fleet into the Black Sea because, or at least any major presence, because I believe actually what one of the copes was or justifications was is that the Mediterranean fleet, which I think is, if I have my fleet numbers right, the American Sixth Fleet, the waters are too shallow to actually support the American ships in the Black Sea. So there's that. But I mean, keep in mind you also have Romania, Bulgaria as well, which are NATO members, and both of which I would say are pretty subdued to NATO demands. But what I think will be the really big play here, if we're going to see any action in the Black Sea, it will be British cooperation with Bulgaria and or Romania. I mean, you already had, as you were discussing with the missile strikes, them coming dangerously close to Romanian territory. Some of them arguably flying over Romanian territory in order to conduct these attacks on Russia's part. So this also wouldn't be anything new because we've seen since the beginning of this war, when it has come to a lot of the attacks of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, especially with the drones and with the Storm Shadow missiles. I mean, keep in mind the Storm Shadow missiles are British; they got them from the UK. That it will be a British operation in the Black Sea if there's going to be any rise in tensions. And really, looking at the state of the UK now, both domestically and on the global stage, they do need something to show that they are still a serious player. They do need
Yeah.
something to show that they are worthy of the prestige that they once held. Because looking at the UK's situation domestically, we have just a drop in standard of living. We have economic contraction, economic standards. I mean, looking at growth rates throughout Europe, including non-European Union states, which the UK is part of, most of Eastern Europe has higher growth rates than the UK at this point. Their economy is shrinking. I'm pretty sure the UK is actually officially in a recession. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. The
Yeah.
political situation has been completely unstable. I know Sunak has been in power for the past few months here, but I mean, looking at the embarrassment with Liz Truss last year, cycling through governments, the Conservative Party, which has been in power for what 2010, 2011, they're not offering any real solution, but also Labor or in as so far as relevant they are, the Lib Dems, neither are they. Now, some people speculate that there's a Labour viable, but I don't want to get into internal British politics because really, it's not relevant here. And out of all the electoral politics in the world, I think the British are probably towards the bottom of the list of which I would discuss, but or would like to discuss, I should say. But you have that. You also have the very drawn out and messy Brexit process where getting out of the European Union was a very harsh and taxing process, which, of course, it was to set an example. I'm not blaming this entirely on the British negotiators. Not that I think they did the best job in the world, but you have to realize Brussels' position was going to be always going to be to make an example of the UK at that point, whether that was
Yeah.
by keeping them in the union through a number of backdoor treaties where they're officially out but effectively in. Maybe you could say such as a country like Norway is, just to give a
Hmm.
gross simplification of the situation. Or it was going to be a complete divorce where the UK would be cut off from European markets and it would be a daunting task to try to re-establish a new economic relationship between the UK and continental Europe. So that point being is Brexit was a blemish on the British record. Whether or not you think it was a good idea, personally, I'm not sad to see the European Union lose a member state, especially the UK. And I do think that actually continental politics have taken a slightly positive turn. No, I'm not going to say entirely, but a slightly positive turn in regards to this. I mean, I can only imagine what the sanctions packages the European Union put in place would look like if the UK remained in the European Union. Completely draconian at that point. I mean, not that the sanctions packages are reasonable in the first place, but they would look like, in my personal opinion, child's play compared to what a British seat in the European Union would be proposing for some of these sanctions packages. It's completely absurd. I mean, look at the British sanctions packages. Imagine those combined with the European Union ones. Just honestly, I can't think of another word beyond unfathomable. Complete economic. I don't think I can use that word on YouTube, but I think you guys get the point. But ultimately, what I think we will see, if there's going to be any rising in tension in the Black Sea, it will be the doing of the British. They've had well established operations there since before the war, and especially since the course of the war. They have more or less been serving as Ukraine's navy, if we're being honest, and they will.
Yeah, and even yesterday there were two drone attacks, seaborne attacks by the British. Uh, we're I mean, that's who's supplying the sea surface drones to Ukraine. Both attacks were repulsed, but that's I think what we're going to see in terms of uh, what the Black Sea theater of war, and then probably we'll see some kind of a missile system that was used to hit the Moskva battleship. Now that battleship actually is not sunk. They're repairing it, and apparently they want to restore it. Um, so that's an interesting development that I wasn't aware of until this week. But sorry for cutting you off.
Oh no, I actually didn't know that either. I think that's very important because when the Moskva got hit, that was a huge propaganda win for the West. They ran with it. They made it sound like the entire Black Sea fleet was sunk, but considering the fact that it was repairable and that it's going to be repaired if all goes well, that I mean, I know that the narrative has been done, things have already been seeded, but in terms of actual effect in the war and frankly morale on the Russian side, it's a positive development. But as I was saying before, the British have effectively become Ukraine's navy. In many ways, much how the U.S. was ISIS's air force for the longest time. In terms of naval operations, in terms of preventing, at least in this war, total Russian domination of the Black Sea, the British have really been the only thing standing in between that. Now, the Americans and the other European powers have provided huge amounts of aid, so don't get me wrong. But in terms of actual sea power and what remains of Ukraine and what control they have of the Black Sea, then it's really all thanks to the British. And it's, once again, speaking about the position of the British both domestically and internationally, this is a boon to the reputation that they need. Expect if things do get more tense in the Black Sea, we will see more media narrative and propaganda drives that we're suddenly supposed to, uh, just in the Anglosphere in particular, but I would say globally, supposed to love the Royal Navy as this great defensive force of freedom or whatever nonsense they decide to shove down our throats with that. But once again, that's assuming tensions in the Black Sea do rise to these levels. Am I predicting an outright hot naval war between the British and the Russians? No, not at this point, not in the near future. But they will continue to be the number one supporter of Ukraine's navy, and they will do everything they can to harass Russian ships on the Black Sea and try to open up that also as a front of the war. Because I know it's part of Ukraine, yes, and that there have been battles on the sea since the beginning of this war, but in terms of what naval warfare could have been, it's been one of the less intense theaters in Ukraine. And I know
Yeah.
I've talked several times about the potential opening of a second front, whether that's in the Caucasus, whether that's in the Balkans, whether that's with Poland, Belarus, etc., or wherever else that might be.
Or
But,
Transnistria.
oh, yes, Transnistria especially. But also, while maybe you couldn't exactly consider a second front, looking to expand this war, looking to stretch Russia even more thin, a flare up in the Black Sea with actual naval engagements could also be that because they will have to dedicate more of their resources to their navy to counter a bolstered Ukrainian navy and whatever supporters they may have. And so far, it's been about a week since the grain deal fell through. We haven't seen any tensions, any at least significant rise in tensions, but you also have to keep in mind that this deal was tentatively in place in some form or another since the beginning of this war, and now that has completely fallen through, there's a vacuum open, one that unfortunately will probably be absorbed by a an expansion of the conflict, something that was to the credit of the negotiating parties, it did keep relative stability in terms of international grain shipments. And I think what's really the elephant in the room here is the grain shipments themselves. And keep in mind that Russia is a vast country, a lot of resources, which I'm sure that especially the Europeans, but the rest of the world has learned as well as Russia has expanded to non-Western markets and has expanded itself to increase trade relations and relations in general with countries like India, China, etc. But Russia is one of the world's largest supplier of grains. Ukraine also a major supplier of grains. And most of that, even though there were pushes to get this into Europe, but even before the war, most of that is going outside of the Western world. It's going to places that are very unstable, like the Middle East and Africa, where if there is a food crisis, not that a food crisis is good anywhere or would foster stability anywhere, but it's, if it's especially in these areas that already are less stable, you could see a lot of maybe what we would have seen during the Arab Spring, for example. Now, am I predicting another Arab Spring? But no, I'm not. As sure as much as I'm sure the American Empire would love something like that, I'm not predicting that outright. But in terms of African and Middle Eastern and other, let's just say, less developed nations, to put it politely, in terms of their food supply, their internal stability, the resources that they receive, a lot of this could be jeopardized by the ending of what was more or less a non-aggression act in the Black Sea, something that allowed merchant ships to get through relatively unimpeded. And of course, it'll take months to see the effects of this finally start to take place, assuming that there are proper stockpiles in place. And so far as that, I don't know the proper stockpiles of these various nations that receive it. But we're talking a something that could go from a regional crisis to a global crisis. In which case, if there's famine, there's going to be violence and unrest there. With violence and unrest and famine, there's going to be more people trying to flee from those countries, creating yet another wave of migrants. And now that they don't have the COVID excuse, European borders are going to be wide open. I mean, you even had the so-called far-right populist government in Italy conceding that, oh yeah, maybe we need migrants to support our pension programs. I mean, once again, if you had
Yeah,
any
yeah.
faith in electoral politics, that should dash your hopes even further, so I'll just throw that out there. But my point is that Europe is probably going to be susceptible, maybe not to the same scale they were in 2015, to another migrant crisis. I mean, not that the first migrant crisis ever stopped. It took a brief pause, but we're looking at a reignition of the migrant crisis as well, on top of all the other economic woes that Europe has suffered as a result of this war. And that's what the grain deal falling through means. Not that I think that the Russians, just speaking purely from their perspective, should have continued this very lopsided negotiation process. While I completely understand why they revoked this, there is a myriad of consequences that will follow from this. And once again, a nation that has been given an elevated level of importance is Turkey. Because almost immediately after the deal fell through, Erdogan was talking about the importance of negotiating a deal that was fair for all sides, etc., etc.,
Yeah.
etc. Which, of course, he would love that. And who could blame him? It puts him
Because he made
in.
money on the tariffs.
Oh, absolutely. And once again, Erdogan is a kingmaker in terms of this time in global politics. If we're talking about grain crisis and food supplies, whereas before it would have been regional politics, whether that was in the Middle East, whether that was between Europe and Russia, whatever. But when we're talking about global food supplies, the man has become a kingmaker. He can make or break this. And what direction he'll take, who knows? He's very self interested, and I guess if you want to be as generous to him as possible for whatever reason, you could say he has the interests of Turkey as his foremost priority. Which, how true that is, look, I'll just say he probably has Turkish interests more as his concern than, say, Western leaders do for
Hmm.
their countries, for example. A
Yeah.
low bar, I know, but still. And
Mhm.
I mean, we're really. I think there's actually some statements by Orban that can sum this up very well because Orban had said that Russia cannot be separated from the rest of the world. And of course, Europe can be separated from Russian energy, but this is actually an illusion and will not have an effect because Russia cannot be separated from the rest of the world. Someone else will buy Russian raw materials, and we are suffering from military inflation and losing our competitiveness. And he went on to say that before the start of the Ukrainian conflict, the European Union paid $300 billion in euro for oil and gas annually, while in 2022 the amount of payment was up to 653 billion. And he also said that Western companies do not seek to leave Russia, and that there's still 1.4 thousand Western firms and in Russia, and actually of the amount that have left, only about 8.5% have left, and the rest continue to operate in Russia. So once again, he's if I had to put Orban in perspective, look, I think he's done great things for Hungary. I think he actually is a good leader. If I was in Hungary, I'd probably be a very strong supporter of him, at least with what I know about him now. But realistically, since the beginning of this war, in my mind, what he represents is just the rational position that a European state should have towards Russia at this point. And it's
Hmm.
once again, it's not even some sort of strong fraternal relations with Russia. That's not what Hungary has with Russia by any means. But it is a pragmatic, business oriented, what's good for our economy, what's good for our people sort of relationship. And once again, I'm not European, but just as somebody looking at the facts presented to me, perhaps I could be wrong. Look, feel free to disagree with me here. But what Orban and what Hungary have pursued, even before the war, and especially since this war commenced, is a very pragmatic, middle of the road approach to Russia for a European state, even in the backdrop of a war on the continent. Because, I mean, look, you can even talk about from the perspective of these European states that because of the spillover, because of the refugees, and because of the economic impact of these industries during the war, that, yeah, maybe you don't want Russia to have Ukraine, whatever. But so far, and I'm not going to pretend like the sanctions packages in the first place were ever intended to dislodge Russia from Ukraine and not punch the Europeans, because they were always intended to punch the European economies, push them down. But looking at it, if we're to take everything we've been told at face value, at this point it would have been far cheaper to let Russia have everything east of the Dnieper River than what these sanctions packages have cost the European economies. Far cheaper. So
Hmm.
clearly that's not the motivation here. I mean, look, I don't think I need to retread this territory with all of you again. But once again, just looking at it purely pragmatically, if Europe or European states, I shouldn't lump them all together, at least in this case, if European states were allowed to pursue a much more pragmatic policy without the iron grasp of Washington, which I know is pretty much a fantasy at this point, then with what 10, 11 rounds of sanctions, they've paid 10 or 11 times more than what they would have had they just accepted Russian terms back in April of 2022. I mean, the agenda is plain as day here. I don't think I need to say that the American empire is trying to completely subjugate Europe, put it under its thumb for the indefinite future by completely severing it from Russia. And I think those words are put perfectly by Orban, where Orban, I can repeat his words all day, but really, look, if we don't buy it, the Russians aren't losing, we're losing.
You know, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you know which economy is going to, without saying Russia, which economy is going to exceed Germany this year, according to the IMF, before the end of 2023?
Let me guess.
In Europe, in Europe.
In Europe,
Hmm.
um, Serbia? No, no.
Well, I mean, anything's possible, but
Anything is possible.
Britain,
What really?
the yeah. So everybody understands how much the cost of living has skyrocketed in Britain, and by no means is there like any kind of real recovery. But Britain is still supposed to do better than Germany before the end of
So it's
2023,
so it's a
according
complete
to the
race to the
IMF.
bottom, is what you're
Yeah,
telling
that's
me.
how bad it is.
That I mean, look, I knew, especially after the Nord Stream demolitions and after winter of 22, 23. I mean, look, look, mild winter. They lucked out more than I think they could have ever hoped for. But once again, they were able to keep the lights and the heat on at the cost of their national industry. I think that's worth putting in perspective when people try to naysay what happened in the German winter. Sure, they didn't all freeze to death, they didn't all starve to death. Fortunately, I don't want to say that happened to any nation, really. But they completely tanked their economy in the process, and we're starting to see the effects of that. But I still would have assumed, just based on trends, that the British were still further down the descent to hell. But I'm shocked and a little unsurprised, but I am taken aback by the news that apparently Germany is doing worse economically. And I, like I said, I can really think of no other term to describe this than a complete race to the bottom between the two.
Yeah, and as I saw another article, as with Germany, so goes Europe. I wonder if maybe some of the strategists. I mean, I know it's very conspiratorial, but maybe leaving the European Union was in preparation for something like this. I don't know because it would be a safeguard. Think of all the countries that have switched to the euro within the EU. Now, of course, Hungary isn't one of them, and Britain never was, but that is a safeguard, right? So who knows? Maybe there was a part of the British elite that they knew this war was inevitable, and because the arguments by Labour and most of the people who were the Remainers, of course, was that economically this would be very bad for Britain, and as it turns out, it has been. I mean, I will admit it. I was for Brexit. I was elated when it happened. I think a lot of people in the dissident right were very happy with that. It was like one of the first, big W's that we had. But
I mean, I know it all seems like
it's
small potatoes right now, but Brexit going through is what convinced me that Trump actually had a shot at winning.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, good point. But now after 6, 7 years, obviously, it's not just that economically things are more difficult for Britain, and we're so becoming, even before the war is exacerbating those negative effects, but and creating new ones that are just peculiar to the war itself. But um, I feel like it is safer for them to go this route in the long run. So maybe somebody knew. I think there were a lot of people that knew that there would be a war, right? Uh, you could even argue that as much as like the average Joe Brexiter who wanted to see Brexit happen, like Farage, well, not that he's an average Joe, right? Um, if Hillary had won, right, a similar kind of situation probably would have happened. And,
Oh no, I've said since the
you know,
beginning of this war, while I'm not going to defend Zelensky, while I think, look, there are so many things you could say about him and Joe Biden as well, the combination of Hillary Clinton and Poroshenko kicking off this war, I think would have been cataclysmic compared to even what we have now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, she's even crazier than Biden. Um, it would have been like Washington Sisterhood of Newland and
Yeah, the coven.
the Coven. Yeah, the Coven will destroy
it,
Putler.
it would have made for great Russian propaganda. I'll just say that much.
Yeah.
Yeah, the brave Muscovite crusaders against the Covenants. Yeah, but instead we just have let's just say the Jewish white powder enthusiast and his senile handler. It
Yes.
really is just a discount version of everything that we would have gotten in 2016, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Man, there's yeah, I this I want to okay to get seriously back on track with what you're saying about Brexit and shielding against some of the more adverse effects that this war would have caused. I mean, looking at Brexit in the European Union, like I said, I to this day think it's a good thing that the British left the European Union. Now, my reasons for that have changed a lot since it initially happened, but still, anything to just piss on the European Union, I'll more or less support within reason. But part of it, and it's actually funny because this was an argument of a lot of the Remainer crowd, was that it would integrate the British further into a overt American control. In which case, I do think part of that is true. But with that, I do think there were factions on both sides of the pond in both the U.S. and the U.K., particularly from the more quote unquote right wing, quote unquote conservative, that did view the Europeans as a bit of liability, that did want more Anglophone, Anglosphere cooperation, so to speak, and that wanted to bring the two nations into a closer understanding, and that they understood that in the event of a future confrontation, it would be much more valuable to have a stronger Anglo-American relationship than either an American-European or a British-European relationship. So, and I do think that a lot of what the British have been able to do in this war is because of the both physical and metaphorical distance that they do have from continental Europe at this point, that they are able to perform these operations. Not to mention also being the Anglophone country. I mean, how the language originated there, but let's be honest, much like the Brazilians have supplanted Portuguese, the Americans have supplanted English. But that's aside the point.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but with that, once again, it does relegate them with the Americans becoming the predominant power, even just down to a language thing, where they are the American satellite state. I mean, all of Europe is full of American satellite states, but the flagship American satellite state in in Europe. Now, I know you can point to a lot of the disagreements and a lot of the butting of the heads that London and Washington have had, but fundamentally, once again, those are internal conflicts. There's nothing of great civilizational importance that the two disagree on. Where you could say it's not much, but there are ever so slightly issues that say Washington and Brussels diverge on.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's exemplified by someone like Macron. Now Macron will always fall in line. He'll always do what he's supposed to. But I think even
Yeah.
just down to his rhetoric or some of his actions leading up to that, you can tell where that divergence is. Where that divergence between London and Washington, it's a far narrower gap. It's negligible compared to what the gap between Washington and Brussels is, which is, I mean, just tiny. But like, I mean, just for comparison, we're talking ocean-sized rifts between Washington, Moscow, Washington, Beijing, etc. Just to put things in perspective. So fundamentally, when we're looking at a global picture, these are very small differences. But when we zoom in, when we're talking about their relations into each other, independent of, well, you can't really do it independent of what's going on in the outside world. But when you're taking a very particular view, when you're taking a very close, a microscopic view, I should say, those things start to become much clearer. And it really does inform you of some of the directions the West could go in, the disagreements, and the powers that are at play here. Sometimes London gets its way, sometimes Washington gets its way. I mean, I know I was just calling it the preeminent satellite state, but if we're being honest, out of any country aligned with the Americans that can sway it, barring Israel, Israel is a whole other beast in and of itself. And once again, we've gone over that. We've gone over the dynamics between the U.S. and Israel. I'm sure you don't need to repeat it, but I think any country that can sway the path of the American empire, the British have a unique ability to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, like I've been saying since the beginning of this war, and like you also much have been saying since the beginning of this war, that the British are going to use this as their opportunity to reassert themselves not only as a European power but as a world power. And the fact that they're now outperforming the Germans makes that look much more realistic. That they are, and hell, when isn't that going to be a great propaganda play when they can drum up the Churchill quotes and the World War II symbolism about the lone remaining island of freedom against the totalitarian war machine in the East, etc., etc., etc. And you know damn well, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but at some point, if this war goes on long enough, you will get that narrative. As continental Europe does start to decline, if the British stay at least one leg above them, they can use that to their advantage. They can run with that for years. And they can become the shining beacon of Europe. They can become the example. And once again, falling right back in the trap, the Europeans are going to want to emulate them, which once it becomes a vicious cycle, feeding right back in the hands of the American Empire, and it really puts us at what I can only call a civilizational stalemate at this right now. I know there are the very optimistic people on one side and the complete black pillars on another side, thinking that, of course, Russia's going to lose this war, of course, everything's going to collapse on itself, or Russia's going to win in Ukraine, that's going to set off a chain event that is going to collapse the entire European and Western structure as we know it. But fundamentally, I think what most people don't realize, and frankly because it's the boring option, is that things are completely gridlocked. That it's going to be like this for decades before any side really has a leg up on another. I would say regardless of the outcome of Ukraine. Now, the outcome of Ukraine will accelerate it by several decades in one direction or another, and that's assuming Ukraine even has a clean conclusion, which there's a very real possibility this becomes one of those decades-long low-intensity wars. I'm not discounting that at all. But fundamentally, I think what the Ukraine war showed more than anything else between the dynamics between Russia, China, the West, etc., is that things are completely gridlocked. Sure, you have, I guess what you could say is steep decline in the West, but it's tempered by the fact that opposing Russia, and I suppose as we continue on further, opposing China, gives a whole new legitimacy to them that they can milk for decades. Now, will those be fun decades? Will those be prosperous decades? Absolutely not. But it still gives them a reason to justify their existence. Once again, a reason they've been vying for to justify their existence.
Yeah.
But I suppose that being said, we do have quite a bit of news about. I think the other two big stories before we get into some of the smaller stuff to round out the show, which will probably take us about another hour if I have my time frame straight, is
Hmm.
the developments with Wagner, and I guess you could say their rebranding and reorganization, especially operating out of Belarus. The nonsense going on between Belarus and Poland, which is an outgrowth of the Wagner thing, and also the Strelkov instance. So I don't know which one you want to tackle first. Which one? Yeah, floor's yours. It's
Well,
whichever.
I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose we can start with Wagner,
Okay.
because I think there's much more to say about Strelkov,
Yeah, and
and
I've been hogging the mic, so I'll hand it over to you for a little bit.
that's all right. Um, so yeah, Wagner has, of course, we spoke about it on the last show. They are now in Belarus. Uh, as you know, like that base has been expanded, but then they were also sent. This is such a troll. Um, to an area of very close to Brest. Brest is an old city. I think at one time it was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth,
I mean, it's
and
I would say it's most famous for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended
that's
the
right.
eastern front of World War One. So yeah, it's on the very western fringe of Belarus, and whether it fell under the German Austrian jurisdiction, the Polish jurisdiction, or the actual Russian jurisdiction at that time, I actually do not know off the top of my head. But it's one of those border towns that it's one of those. Let's just say it's one of those Commonwealth towns that was
Yeah.
back in the days of Paradisus Judaeorum. Yeah, look that one up. That one's some fun.
And I'll give you a bit of Slavic history about Brest, the city. So Brest is the now Macedonians and Serbians. Of course, the word Brest means elm tree. It's pronounced slightly differently in Belarusian. In Russian, I believe it's slightly different, or when they hear it, I think it might mean something like bark, but like the bark of a tree. But when Slavic tribes moved into the Balkans, one of those Slavic tribes were the Beretsi, according to like the Roman sources at the time, and they moved into a town north of where I was born, into a town named Kichevo. And part of this tribe eventually moved back north from whence they came and set up the city of Brest. So little bit of Slavic history. Um, so I mean, obviously, it was there to trigger the Poles, and the Poles, you could say they took the bait, but I mean, the truth is the Poles have been expanding their military uh, prowess, you could say, by investing something like close to 14% of their GDP to increase. Like they are ordering HIMAR missiles, not just the HIMAR platforms used to launch them, which are like some of the most any country has ever ordered, but faster than the U.S. can produce them, right? And they also brought to the border near the town of Brest striker armored personnel carriers. Well, they're more infantry fighting vehicle than an armored personnel carrier. They're more substantial that way, carry slightly fewer troops, but have more um, gun power, so to speak. Um, of course, the photo of Prigozhin in this camp in his underwear and t-shirt is hilarious. If you guys are on Telegram, uh, there is a hilarious meme of Prigozhin on the left, dressed in a tuxedo at some kind, sitting at a banquet table, like some kind of a gala event, you know, expectation, reality, and then he's like in this, he's in his underwear and t-shirt, and looking a bit glum in one of these big military tents. But that said, um, the money that was seized when they raided his house, that has been given back. So it's a bit misleading, but the name of this Telegram channel, I think, is called Missiles and Nukes. It's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. The mod is one of the funniest guys. There is I presume he's an American named Johnny, and Johnny rants and says all kinds of things. Johnny never leaves. Like he's not there at every post. And then what the mod for Missiles and Strikes does is he will like quote what Johnny says, and then everybody just laughs.
Oh, it's amazing. That's what I aspire for this
It's
program to
it
be.
is amazing. It's one of the I wouldn't tolerate Johnny, but the mod for Missiles and Strikes is a bigger man than me. So so that said, you know, obviously something is brewing there now. They don't have a force that's big enough. It could be just a diversion to try to keep the Ukrainians occupied. Um, like I would say, that effect is happening in the from the Kremenaya to Kupiansk northern front. It's forcing the Ukrainians to relocate some of their troops from Zaporozhye. Today, actually, the White House said that they have started the counteroffensive, like it's going big time. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but I think the way to read that is that they're going to send every reserve they have. Like they are going to go all out. They have to produce something. Now, what the Russians are doing in that area, of course, is forcing them. But is it really working in this area just west of Kiev? I'm not so sure, right? Um, I think Wagner is there because Wagner literally fought, and it's by no means the only reason, but Wagner fought a lot of Belarusians uh, in Bakhmut, and in a way, this safeguards any potential color revolution that happens there. I don't believe like the whole Wagner mutiny coup, whatever you want to call it, was designed just so they were slated to be cut anyways, right? Uh, I don't think that was done just so they could move to Belarus. That's not a complicated situation for them to do that. And yes, it made um, Putin look weak, but as I said, I don't think geostrategically it will change anything. It's already become like something funny, but from a Western point of view, like if you're a Russian examining how the West depicts Putin and Russia, it has consistently been for decades that Russia is weak, that Russia is incompetent, that Putin is a weak dictator, that he's a weak man, that he's sick, that
Remember
he's
when they said he
emotional.
had what was it? They said Putin had Asperger's that one time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that. I remember that.
I
But
mean, but like
when
it's about every 6 months, and it's increased since this war came out. The Pentagon and or the CIA or somebody has some groundbreaking intelligence reports on some bombshell truth that you need to know about Putin, and it's it's become a joke. It was a joke since the start of it, but especially now, it's just a complete joke.
yeah, so when Prigozhin was moving toward Moscow, well, I mean, he wasn't. He was still in Rostov on Don. It was Udkin. Um, some fairly wealthy, very wealthy Russians, some of them not technically ethnically Russian, maybe of mixed descent, left. Uh, Something like 1.2 billion dollars US left the bank, like their national bank. So we saw this at the beginning of the war. We saw a lot of these people leaving for European countries and for Israel. And then when the mobilization happened, we saw that as well. So Prigozhin moving up there, like a lot of these people left. They thought like, this is going to get. So Prigozhin represents something that's like terrifying to them, right? Because a good deal of the public actually supports Wagner. As I've said for a long time, they desperately want to see some capture of territory. They they cannot accept like just fighting only an attrition war that's entirely defensive and it just goes longer and longer. People need to see progress of some kind, right? Um, so Wagner is probably going to go into a slightly different role. They're going to be in Belarus. They're safe there. They're technically not breaking the Russian law. The guys that didn't want to be in Wagner anymore, those guys are now in the Russian army. They're training. They've created some new Z stormtrooper units. Some of these guys are like right on the front lines and very intense assault units, like high casualties, like just crazy stuff that I've seen. So I think that's his. August 5th. That there's still Remy Lind is still saying that August 5th they're coming back. We're almost there. It's the 26th now. It's already the 27th in Russia and Ukraine. So we're just basically a week away. We'll see what happens. Now I don't know. Now, did you want to talk about Strelkov because that's also or like if you had anything to say about Prigozhin, but I think there'll
Well,
be some comparisons with Prigozhin if we talk about Strelkov.
agreed. But one thing I do think that needs a lot more tension because I think what we see it playing out right now is the situation between Poland and Belarus right now. And I think that's coming to a head. Now, what form that will
Yeah,
take.
it's
Now, whether you want to touch on that before or after some of the Strelkov stuff, I think some of the Strelkov stuff.
no. Let's deal with it now.
Yeah, okay, okay. But with that being said, this has been years in the making, for being honest. So going back, I always like to try to provide a little bit of a grand picture of how we even got to this point. So I'll keep it simple this time around. In August of 2020, almost 3 years ago at this point, we had a color revolution in Belarus following allegedly rigged elections. Now, of course, I accept what the YouTube term of service say. No election in the history of the world has ever been fraudulent. But The West disagreed in this case. And I'm not saying whether I co-sign their disagreement or not. I'm just saying that is objectively what they thought in August of 2020.
Mhm.
So as a result, as we've seen many times before, whether that was in the Maidan, whether that was in Georgia, whether that was in Lebanon, once again, you can go down the list with all these color revolutions. The people took to the streets in massive numbers, allegedly. They had their own special flag planned. They had their own president in exile chosen. You still hear every once in a while something from Tinovskaya. I think she is still living in exile in Lithuania, which,
Yeah.
I mean, is that not the perfect fitting place for a pretender for the president of Belarus to live? I cannot think of a better place than Lithuania, of all countries. So, that plays out. You get those very interesting scenes. I remember there was the one of Lukashenko walking out of the helicopter holding the rifle with the bulletproof
Yeah.
vest. Um, Credit where is due to the man. Many men would have either crumbled or fled under much lesser circumstances. He was ready to fight to the
Mm,
end for
he really
for
was.
what it was. I mean, now it's a predicament he put himself in because in the lead up to this color revolution, this fraudulent election, he was toying with the West. He was talking to Pompeo. They were slated to open a U.S. embassy in Minsk, and of course that all fell through because. And look, I think Lukashenko frankly learned his lesson. I'm not saying he's the brightest guy in the world, but I think he realized that playing this back and forth game has become too high risk of a prospect. So that has been shelved, that has been put to rest. And after August 2020, moving into September, that fizzled out. Lukashenko more or less had his grasp on power secured. Only problem is, you have all these color revolutionaries sitting in Belarus that, out of the ones who weren't prosecuted and locked up or exiled, they are an idle force. You have these trained fifth columnists of the American Empire. Now, there's low intensity fighting in Ukraine at this time, but this is also, we move on about, let's see, 8 months or so, and we have April 21 with the Russians mounting on the Ukrainian border. Many people thinking this is going to be the final confrontation before they actually go to war. But that was delayed for about another year, about another 10 months. And then you have this war in Ukraine. You have all this idle human capital from your failed color revolution in Belarus, either living underground or in exile. You mobilize them again, you send them to Ukraine, you cut their teeth in battle. As you were saying, a lot of them were in Bakhmut, a lot of the Belarusian dissidents were in Bakhmut. And then you ferry them back. You have Poland raise a ruckus about the way the Belarusian people have their human rights violated and that they might need to support a popular armed insurrection against the Minsk government. And that puts you in the position that we have here. Now, I do think one of the strangest turns of events around all of this is that you've brought this up before. As you recall, Lukashenko actually had several members of Wagner detained back before the 2020 color revolution, in which case he was leaning very westward at the time. Not entirely, but very much so westward.
Hmm.
And you have several high profile Wagner members arrested under his watch. And then you, of
Yep.
course, you have the color revolution, so that all ties back into each other. Then you have Wagner. Come, they have their claim to fame in the Ukrainian war, especially. You have the incident about a month ago with the so-called March on Moscow by Prigozhin and his boys. Now it puts you in the present-day situations. You have Wagner rebuilding itself in Belarus. You have the rebrandings, the shuffling going on there. You have Poland once again agitating about the situation in Belarus, that Russia's doing a military buildup there, and that Poland has to respond in kind with its own military buildup because they fear that this could be a potential front because, of course, Russia's looking to retake the entire Warsaw Pact, as we all know. And now it's at a complete standoff. More and more Polish troops and equipment are being moved to the Belarusian border. The Belarusians are signing more and more cooperative agreements with Russia. At this point, I believe that the Belarusians actually have Russian nukes in their territory, which, although it's not that much further west, it still does shorten response times in the case that you would need to deploy those sort of weapons. Not only just the nukes. You have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Russian forces in Belarus still. Many people speculated months ago that they were going to be used to open up another offensive against Kiev, but once again, they have been waiting for, at least in my estimation, a potential operation where they may have to seize the Kaliningrad corridor by force or face off against the Polish by force. Now, Poland, I know I've been harping on this from since the beginning of the war, frankly, going all the way back to May of 22, I believe, that they see this war, of course, as an opportunity to expand their own power and usefulness to the broader West. That they can be the bulwark, they can be the exception to the LGBTQ CIA because they are the ones defending the West from the Russian hordes, the Russian Asiatic hordes, as I'm sure some of them may say. And look, we saw the cooperation agreements signed between the Ukrainian and Polish governments. You still have to this day the speculation that Polish troops will be brought in as quote unquote peacekeepers in parts of western Ukraine. But what seems to be more and more likely as we move further into this conflict and as tensions rise even further, that Poland wants to provoke Russia via Belarus. And that is the
Mm-hmm.
method in which they're looking to get into this war. Which is the reason you, of course, had Russia sign these agreements with Belarus, sign this military cooperation. And I would say, most importantly, whether you want to think that the Prigozhin push was a planned op or whatever, that's not really relevant. But point being is the perfect excuse landed to put your most hardened mercenary outfit in one of your client states. So it's really the perfect storm that's forming right now. I don't know what other way to put it. Where we've seen brinksmanship on both sides. I would say the Poles were looking for any excuse to expand this conflict for a myriad of reasons, and the Russians responded in kind. And now we are a handful of major instances away. I'll just put it that way. We are one chain of events away from Poland being forced to intervene in Belarus. Now, I don't know whether it has this designation. I imagine it would, but say Wagner is declared a terrorist organization, in which case that gives the Poles or whoever else wants to join in on the so-called coalition license, according to quote-unquote international law, to intervene in Belarus to expunge this terrorist organization. It's a very convenient cover. I could see them going with an angle like that. That's one of many angles they could take, but I think that is a likely one that they could do if they wanted to pull off an operation like this. In which case, they can go in, they can put an end to the state sponsors of terrorism in Belarus and this terrorist organization called Wagner, and be that much closer to the Russian border, fight a war in what is effectively Russian territory with Russian co-ethnics, which is the reason that Russia at least said it was going to Ukraine in the first place, which really it creates, at least the West would want to create in that case, a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Either they can let Poland roll over Belarus, they can let them have their victory there, or you could have a much harsher Russian response that could risk escalating this entire war with NATO. So that is the play that I think they're trying to do right now with everything going on in Belarus. Now, for all I know, it could just be a massive bluff. It could just be typical brinksmanship. But I think, given the direction, given the level of buildup that we've seen from a country like Poland in particular, it is, at least in my opinion, undeniable that this is a country gearing up for war in some way, shape, or form. Now, I would have thought that it would have been more directly into Ukraine, more to bolster the Ukrainian war effort. I mean, keep in mind this is a country that has tens of thousands of quote unquote volunteers in Ukraine as it is. So it's not beyond the stretch of the imagination, especially with those guys who went there, got their taste in battle, got their combat experience, come back, and are the spearhead effort to dislodge the quote unquote terrorist organization from the quote unquote state sponsor of terrorism in Belarus.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good synopsis of probably the main reason why they're there. And there is that crazy intrigue, like why were they there during the run up to the attempted color revolution in Belarus, and the SBU of Ukraine was involved in that from the articles I read. There's something very strange about that, about that whole scenario. Um, I don't know what to say. Like on face value, what that sounds like is like, was Wagner working with Ukraine? You know, was Wagner leading them astray? Was this a sting between Lukashenko and Ukraine? Because like Lukashenko has really come around in 3 years. I think people don't understand how both sides of the game he was playing,
I
right?
mean, I think there's also the
Uh,
likely scenario that the Ukrainians and, of course, their Western backers felt uncomfortable with what Lukashenko was doing. The Russians, in turn, felt uncomfortable with what Lukashenko was doing, trying to walk that tightrope. So they were both simultaneously trying to execute that. I mean, these kind of things happen all the time where uh,
mhm.
they find, like, yeah, they're both opposed to, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, to Lukashenko's government at that point, but for polar opposite reasons.
Yeah. Um, yeah, yeah, of course. So, I find that I always found that quite a bit of a mystery. And there was that guy that was arrested that had spoke with Pyatt in Greece. This all happened around the same time. Anyways, or within a year of the events, actually in 2021. So it would have been like 9 months later. Anyhow, yeah, I do think that's a very good synopsis. If you want, we can move on to Strelkov.
Okay, I get the feeling you have. I mean, you were telling me quite a bit what you were saying off air, and I'm going to give the reins to you on this one because I think you have quite a bit of interesting things to say about this.
Okay, so I mean, I want to preface with what I'm about to say. That the guys again, Franz and Conrad from World War Now, uh, had an excellent podcast that was done a few days ago. You can check them out on YouTube and Substack, and they talked about Strelkov. There's a few things that we haven't mentioned about Strelkov. There's Our audience probably already knows a lot about him, and I wouldn't doubt it if some of the people in our audience probably knows more about him than we do, and probably the guys at WWN probably know more. So thank you for them for filling me in on a lot of information about Strelkov that I didn't know. So Strelkov is he is a devout Orthodox Christian. Um, he apparently did go to he met Pyosis, the monk from Mount Athos, who made who had prophecies about World War III and what would happen. Um, it's maybe important to keep that in mind based on like what I'm going to get into about Strelkov. And I'm some of the good and the bad about him. So, he was very instrumental in the, Dugin's Russian Spring back in 2014 as a reaction to the coup in Kiev. Um, he was instrumental in Crimea, but also in the Donbass. But there were some things that that he did that also angered a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about the Russian MOD, because in many ways his actions were trying to draw Russia into a war that Russia did not want to fight then. Uh, and admittedly,
Nor
you're
was it
dealing with
prepared
Putin.
for, even if it wanted to.
Right, right. Um, so I think he lost sight of that. I mean, he is former FSB. He still has some contacts there. And for people who don't know, Strelkov was arrested this week. So That's why we bring up Strelkov. Um, he wanted to hold on to Kramatorsk, but he didn't fortify the heights around it. This is an area that's lower downhill, and we know in such a flat terrain as in Ukraine, any elevation that you can take and hold is incredibly important, right? So there were some people that were upset about that, and then he fled from Slavyansk, obviously because there weren't enough forces, but he left his units there. He went in the back of a car and a trunk that was covered with bulletproof vests. And it was around this time that Motorola actually went in, broke through Ukrainian encirclement in Slavyansk, and rescued the units that were there. Then he had a plan for Donetsk city, like how to avoid it from being taken. His suggestion was to blow up now this one I do remember reading way back in 2016, because even in 2016 I did keep abreast of some of the developments that were happening there. And he wanted to blow up the first 20 blocks of around Western Donetsk city, because he felt that that would give them a better hiding place, and more of a shield in case of an encirclement of the city, which in 2014 and 15 was a very real thing. But the people there were like, "You're crazy! You can't do this." And he was generally making the Russian MOD and probably Putin himself pretty upset, because his actions were trying to draw them into a situation that, as you said, they were not ready for. Whether they were ready and they didn't realize it, or not, like they weren't ready, if that makes sense.
Yes, even if they were
Um,
materially ready, their mindset as a nation was not there yet.
no, and also, 2022, obviously the Russians are working much more closely with the Russians than they were in 2014, right? 2014, the announcement of the Belt and Road and all of this chaos that had broken out in the Donbass was not even a year old yet, right? There were big risks that could happen there. I know these plans go further back, but when an announcement is made, not all countries are privy to it, right? And the announcement, like, you cannot have like you cannot have a big war that breaks out when you are announcing this. Do you know what I mean? Like, this would have been a diplomatic and geopolitical disaster, in my opinion. Anyhow, um, so then he said, things like it was a mistake to go to Syria. Russia's going to lose in Syria. They're going to lose Syria and Crimea. Now, part of the reason for this is he believes that, according to the prophecy, Turkey will get involved. So, no, I highly encourage people to listen to um, what Strelkov believes and why he said some of the things that he said. But he angered really a lot of people, and so not everybody is a big fan of his. And of course, there was that feud with Prigozhin. Strelkov went to the front for, I don't know, a month or something, and then he left. Um, like, I admire that he's a devout Orthodox Christian, and obviously Prigozhin is not, right? Despite, he had a room with some very valuable icons and stuff. They found drugs there. They found like $140 million in US. Like, what is going on? Like, another great thing about the podcast is they bring up, like, what does Prigozhin really know compared to what Strelkov knows, and obviously Prigozhin knows a lot more,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
right? Um, but you can't take away that, like, Russia was not ready for this kind of a conflict in 2014, and Strelkov by no means was the only guy that was trying to, just the way the Ukrainians are trying to lure NATO and the U.S. into a wider conflict there. In many ways, that's what Strelkov and others, again, not just him, were trying to do with the Russian MOD and Putin. So he was arrested. There are basically two charges. One, the first one is I don't know. It's kind of an irrelevant charge because it's based on a post that he did on Telegram, where now I did read this in Slavian Guard as well about 3 days ago, maybe 4 days ago. There's a section in the Russian law that has 280 and 282. 282 laws. That one was why it was a hate speech law. Some people are thinking maybe it was like an anti-Semitic remark, but it hasn't been defined yet. But the main charge, the reason he has been locked up, and I think it's very arbitrary because it's based on a post that he did 14 months ago. And it's a claim that units within the Russian military were not being paid. Right? Now, why would you use that? Right? Because, he has called Putin an idiot, that he is, bad for the country, 23 years of disaster. Like, the Ukrainians love Strelkov. They love Strelkov. And there's a lot of people who were not familiar with the war until February 2022, who, would cite something Strelkov would say. And Strelkov is not wrong all the time. Strelkov does point out weaknesses. And ironically, many of the criticisms that Strelkov made against the Russian MOD, so did Prigozhin, right? And so did I. I mean, I got banned from
Oh, I
you remember
remember
last year.
this.
You remember this? Slavian Guard, anti-NATO. There's all kinds that, like, I'm banned. I cannot post anything or like. Even Joaquin Flores banned me, and I don't know what I said. I haven't, like, that happened sometime this year. I don't know what I said to, like. So, anyways,
You're infamous.
I'm infamous. I made those criticisms, and like, Strelkov has a big voice. He has a very big following on VK. He has a very big following on Telegram, and there is a way that the Russian government, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has performed that has been much to be desired, like especially the first Chechen war. And I mean, I know with friends of mine, one in particular, who he doesn't understand why they're just not fab bombing the whole place, and there's no explaining, and they just feel like the government is completely incompetent, and they're just very black-pilled. And I think a lot of it has to do with the last 33 years, right, of events. And this friend of mine, he's my age. He's just a few years younger than I am. And so he lived through the part of the 90s, and so it's understandable. But what I'm saying is why was Strelkov arrested on, like, such an irrelevant post, right? Like, it could have been cleared up then. The other charge is vague. I don't know, like, what is it about? Again, it's very incidental because way back in 2022, after the war started, remember I did some podcasts about a Swiss author that challenged the 6 million, and
Yes.
so remember, I forget his name now, but he's been living in Russia since 2020. Sorry, since 2000. He's married. As far as I know, he probably still sells his books. There's a warrant for his arrest in both Austria and Switzerland, where he's from. there's the news channel one where that woman is talking to this other guy who's like a famous kind of conservative Russian, and they kind of laugh about like the Jews not taking seriously um, their own narrative and supporting Zelensky, and it wouldn't be the first time they've made stupid mistakes like this and got themselves in trouble. That's just something you could never ever hear in main. So what I'm saying is that the charges are arbitrary, and even the professor that challenged the figures of the thingamajig that happened in the mid 20th century. It wasn't the university that charged them, but a separate Jewish group that did. So I think they're like, especially if you listen to the podcast of WWN, it could be arbitrary, right? Like that might indicate that the Russians are going to do maybe a sweep. They're going to maybe do a mobilization again. I hear talk of that again. Uh, there are more people fighting now in Ukraine, both Ukrainians and Russians, than last year. And I would say even from Bakhmut, the casualties are even higher for both
Yes, and of
sides.
course, I think Ukraine's on its 11th mobilization, and there's speculation out of the Kremlin that another 500,000 out of Russia will also be
Yes,
mobilized.
that's right. That's right. And Ukraine has been in a state of mobilization for over 550 days. Think about that, right? Constant mobilization. And so the theory is that the guys presented was they're afraid that there's going to be hiccups, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be mistakes, there are going to be high casualties because this war, like if you gain territory, you gained it because you surprised them. Russia gained all that territory in the south, which is what it wanted far more than the north, because it protects Crimea basically, and it makes Crimea even more feasible because it was a surprise, because they weren't ready, right? And after that, this whole war has been attrition because the reliance on drones went up, and trench work has proven to be a, an enormous obstacle, not to mention mines. And so there's huge casualties that are going to be involved if you want to take the territory, right? That's why breaking points in our attrition are so important, because going headlong is probably not going to work for either side. And the argument is, will will Strelkov, you know, will he blackpill the people? Right? It's it's possible, right? I subbed to him on VK, and then a few months ago, like I just unsubbed. It's just there's only so much I can listen to it. I'm a very black-pilled person myself. That's why I brought up like you know um, the amount of channels on Telegram that I was banned because of criticism. Um, Also, people talk about Odessa, right? We were talking about Odessa. We were talking about all the strikes
Yeah.
and how you can't even have a green deal now because Russia is essentially ruining the ports. So it's a moot point. And of course, now we're talking about, does this make Odessa like a legitimate target? Does this mean that Russia is going to eventually make a move for Odessa,
Well,
right?
I do think just on that point,
And I
a small bit of interjection I have is looking at the direction things have taken, the collapse of the grain deal, and the West's conditions for negotiations. Although I think this has been evident far from before this point, I think there's no denying it at this point that ultimately, with the conditions the West wants to quote unquote negotiate under, the Russians at this point effectively have no motivation not to completely demolish the Ukrainian state.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And all I'm saying is, what have I always said about, like, for almost a year? Like, I'll believe it when I see it. You should not expect any big arrow move. I've been saying that for a long time. In fact, even like, because I think what happened in Kherson and Kharkov last year really changed my view of the war, and that's why I said that. I've always said, like, if you think they're going to take that, well, you're going to have to you need another mobilization. So I'm just making the case that harder days ahead are here, right? Um, so maybe that is the reason. I guess we'll find out. September 18th is when he's released. And again, according to the podcast, um, there's going to be a BRICS meeting that's taking place around that time. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Um, but like I say, Strelkov, I think he means well, but I think the kind of like obviously Prigozhin understands that Putin still has the last word, even if he's left the war to Gerasimov and Shoigu, right? And why Prigozhin was allowed to behave in such an inordinate way, given the history of the Russian military, is beggars belief. It is such an anomaly, right? Like, you could talk about Patton being very vocal and people getting sick of him within the military, but not necessarily the public. That's an example. Generals were shot during Stalin's time. Stuff happens, right?
Yeah.
Wars are they're much dirtier and more complex than people think. Um, so I just wanted to say that, like, there are some things that he has done that weren't as tactful. And this group, Angry Patriots, right? Like, I mean, in a way, now I should say that one of the guys, I think Grubiev is his name. I'm probably mispronouncing it. He was arrested and then released the same day, which means that maybe this is a personal gripe. Maybe that's a personal gripe between somebody in connection with either the Russian MOD or with the Kremlin, who wants this guy to be shut up, and then in September they're going to let him loose. Now, you can argue that Putin doesn't care if he looks weak, because that's all anybody in the West ever says. But you can make also the argument for other countries, like, they don't want him to look weak either. Countries that are ostensibly on his side. Uh, Countries that want to join BRICS. There's 40 of them that want to join BRICS. So that number has only increased. Uh, it's not a good look, right? It doesn't really help Putin, but again, Strelkov has a very big following, right? And maybe tougher days are coming ahead, and they don't want him to do this. I don't know. We don't know right now. We will know, but it will probably take several weeks before we find out, and it may be just something we have to wait till September to find out.
Yes.
But I've gone on too long. I'm sorry.
No, no, I think you're covering very important points here. And with Strelkov, I will agree with what you said, especially starting out, that I will never take anything personally away from this man who, once again, was responsible for rallying the populations in eastern Ukraine against the Kiev government at a time, at probably the most crucial time in recent history when it comes to this, because looking at, and you'll actually hear this from a lot of critics from Strelkov who think he's just the worst thing in the world, that he's some harsh international terrorist, whatever, that he's the next Osama bin Laden, or whatever narrative they want to concoct about somebody like him, where Strelkov is responsible for the war because he didn't want the ethnic Russians in Ukraine to just sit there and take it when the Kiev government started implementing language bans and more or less
Yeah.
ethnically cleansing them. So I will never take anything away from Strelkov for what he did in those pivotal few months. But I do think even as we got into the opening phases of the Donbass War back 2014, 2015, really what it came down to is it was a man, great man, don't get me wrong, who was in far over his head. Somebody who was found himself in a position to manage something that was just beyond his capability at that time. And after the direction things took in 2015, 2016, of course, he went to Russia. He became this consistent voice on this brewing conflict in Ukraine, especially once the conflict broke out. And I'll admit that throughout the course of the war, his criticisms have been very reasonable. These things they've pointed out do have a lot of weight behind them. Now, as you said, that there's a lot more to consider than just what Strelkov looks at and what he says. Just looking purely at the battlefield, there's a myriad of other factors to consider. But ultimately, I do think that he is somebody with a great amount of public respect in Russia, saying the things he did. He was bound to make a few enemies, of course. And I just want to touch on something you said about Putin and his public projection on this for these countries that maybe want to join BRICS, because of course the West, their opinion can more or less be written off on the sort of subject matter at this point in the game. But it could have possibly, yes, been a power move having such a vocal critic with that kind of record behind him. This isn't just some clown like Navalny who just gets up there and says whatever in order to get Western backing. That the Putler government is so oppressive, they're the Fourth Reich, whatever else. No, this is somebody with actual respectability, somebody with a positive reputation, and who has quite a bit of sway with the Russian public. Now, ultimately, I do think his arrest was, even if it was supposed to be something that was supposed to invoke confidence both in the Russian government at home and abroad, something that at least at home probably did the exact opposite. Something that really
Yeah.
uh, eroded. Now, I'm not saying that this is the end of Putin or anything. Don't get me wrong, but it is probably something that raised a lot of eyebrows. Now, do I think Strelkov is going to end up on some lengthy prison sentence or worse? Absolutely not. I do think that yes, he had, of course, a run-in with the, some somebody at some level, probably mid-level authority within the Ministry of Defense or the FSB, who has connections with, of course, the legal system, who want to, if not lock him away, which I don't think they want to, they just want to drag him through the legal system. They just want to waste his time. They want to put him on edge for the next few months until September, where they let him off with some sort of slap on the wrist, maybe some sort of restriction, and show that not only can they do it to probably the most, let's just say, respected war critic. I think that's a pretty fair title to give to Strelkov. But yeah, if they can do that to him, what's stopping them from doing worse to you for maybe some of these more unhinged war critics? Some of these people who make, let's just say, more absurd criticisms of the MOD, if not people who are outright opposed to the war effort because they're pro-Western liberals or whatever else. But ultimately, I do think this is one of those things that it ultimately they should have just let him say his piece and gone about it. And they've probably, at least in my estimation, have drawn more attention to Strelkov and what he has to say by doing this than if they would have just let him say his piece. Now, I know as you were saying, the Ukrainians, the West, pick up on him. They like to use his quotes against against Russia, against the MOD, for the exact opposite reasons than, for example, somebody like he would, just as a perpetual black pill or perpetual pessimist on his part. But yeah, there's some merit to that. That the fact that he's just feeding these people rhetorical ammunition and propaganda points. But at a certain point, I think it would have been less of a headache just to push him further into the margins, put further in the sidelines. Don't really acknowledge what he says in that regard, and just continue on with business as usual. But now they've brought him to the forefront yet again, and it's going to be a story. Not only does it look bad, not only do I disagree with the decision just on a matter of morals and principles, but it's bringing his arguments and his points that he's been making this entire war back to the forefront. Why does the Kremlin want to shut this guy up or put him, or at
Mm-hmm.
least, or at least uh, rough him up a bit? Not even physically, but at least you get the point. Why do they want to punish this guy if what he's saying is just nonsense? I know it's not a universe they can go by. If somebody's saying the truth, that they're going to, of course, face backlash for it. I mean, there's people who say all sorts of outlandish things who rightfully face backlash for them. But with, like I said, somebody with the reputation of Strelkov, it's just there's no good way to slice this. I understand the theoretical justifications, but ultimately, with the execution of something like this, there's no way that the Kremlin could come out looking good to anyone because of this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just make two corrections and what I said earlier about Strelkov back in the early days, and it was I said Kramatorsk. I meant Slavyansk is where he didn't prepare defenses in the heights, but also, the people in Donbass wanted him to leave because he basically told them all is lost. You should be fleeing to Russia. Like, it's just something that annoys certain people, right? I mean, obviously, unofficially, Russia was supporting the Donbass. I mean, I just there's my friend's friend actually went and volunteered to fight. Now I don't know who this guy is. I never met him, but that's just one story amongst many, right? And Russia was sending aid, obviously, right? Even even the battle of uh, Mogila, like they were shelling from like the Russian side, um, around Ilyavosk. That's really like what kept the Donbass militias alive at a very crucial moment. Um, you could interpret that like Strelkov is thinking like fast enough. I know how this is going to go, blah blah blah. But ultimately he didn't, right? And you know to tell them to like turn parts of Eastern Donetsk into rubble because that would be a better way to defend, and then saying, and once they refused, like residents were upset with that. To say like, well, you should flee because this is a hopeless situation. I mean, you could argue that if Russia didn't invade in 2022, it was going to be hopeless, and that after 6 years of NATO training and NATO supplies to Ukraine, and building up their army, training 5 to 8 brigades per year, to work with command and control NATO headquarters, like that was going to happen, right? But I'm just saying that I think the Kremlin knew that there was a timeline, right, and eventually it was going to happen. We see articles like the last 24 hours saying Russia is not going to run out of missiles. And what does that tell you? Well, it tells you they have too been preparing for this military industrial complex to challenge the entire West. That also includes America, right? I'm just saying he's not privy to that. He doesn't know that, and he there's just there is a litany of unfortunate comments that he has made, and he should be more aware he should be more aware of the kind of impact he has and the kind of respect that he's gained. Now, with like the younger people, the younger people in this war, for them, Strelkov is already like something more in the past, right? These unfortunate souls that are, you know, fighting on the front lines, that are, you know, in their mid 20s or late 20s. Um, they would have been much younger when this was going on, and you know, they're living in a slightly different, but they would have, they, you know, they know him. They know his reputation exceeds him, and I mean the finer and good points of his reputation, of course, right? Um, yeah, so just, you know, very unfortunate stuff like that. It's just too doomer, like, to tell people after all that fighting, you know, just go to Russia. It's lost. I mean, they wanted him to leave, and he eventually had to leave.
Yes, and
It's amazing how long they held out. You know, it really is, and it couldn't have happened without like diplomacy and, you know, getting the right amount of aid at the right time. You know, that pivotal battle in Debaltsevo. Um, that was a very important moment in this war. It forced the West to negotiate. I mean, they had no intention, but it bought them time.
well, and that's all the Minsk agreements were ever about. I know that we outright had Merkel and Western leaders saying that, yeah, we agreed to Minsk in order to buy us time, but I mean, fundamentally, that was also the position of the Russians as well. Nobody really expected this to be a lasting peace, but
Yeah.
once again, I agree with everything you said, and I don't think there's really anything I could add to that. I just do have a few small last minute stories to round out the show.
Um,
Unless you have some
can you
further,
give me?
if you have some further points
No,
on.
I will. Yeah, I will say one small point, and then if you could just excuse me for 5 minutes, I'm very sorry, but I
Okay.
will just say this: Shoigu is in North Korea, and you know,
Oh, they finally sent
you
him
were talking
back.
about a.
Finally.
um, you know, he's securing like shells, right? That's why he's there. So the probability of an even greater intensification, yeah, that's probably going to happen,
So was
which
this the
would
plan
also
to
imply.
demilitarize both sides of the Korean Peninsula all along? Was this part of the overall peace plan?
But I'm just saying, yes. But I'm just saying
Yeah.
it tends to indicate that the there is probably going to be a bigger offensive on the Russian side. At the very least, they are expecting the Ukrainians to even increase their numbers and intensity. They're going to go all out. So, anyways, I tend to think that it probably means um, both both things are going to
Yes.
be happening
Yes.
in the next 5 6 weeks. So, with that, please give me 5 minutes, no longer. I will be right back.
Okay. So I just have a few last minute episodes to round out the show. A few last minute episodes. Don't worry, this program will continue for the indefinite future. Look, it will end when it's forced to end. Let's put it that way. But I do just have a few last minute stories and just some economic data and some out of both Europe and the U.S. and just also some polling data. So first is actually some global economic data. I do think that I should have covered earlier in the show, but came to my attention a bit later. So it's just a timeline of the 10 busiest ports in the world. So in 2006, four of them were in Europe, six of them were in Asia, which of those six, two were in China. In 2016, zero in Europe and 10 were in Asia, seven of which were in China. And by 2036, it's estimated that there will be an increase in African ports on this list, particularly in Morocco. So once again, the global economy is shifting away from Europe, and that also plays into some data that I brought up, I think it was a couple episodes ago, about how the European Union's economy retracted so much from the 2008 crisis compared to the American economy, where before the '08 crisis, the European Union combined actually had a larger economy than the US, but now the situation has been inversed. In terms of just a minor point of European American relations, the European Union has announced that it will be having visa requirements for American travelers to Europe, and nothing stringent, at least so far, just standard visa requirements that are about, I think they said, uh, 30 days now. In terms of how long that system will actually take to get online, that is to be determined, but it does look like both sides of the Atlantic are wanting to restrict travel for whatever reason that might be. I'll leave you to speculate on your own, but I, I, I want to see that situation develop a bit more before I give too much information on it. So, we also have, speaking of Europe, Germany. When it comes to German manufacturing, we have had it plummet its PMI. Its PMI rating has plummeted to 38.8, which makes it the 12th consecutive month of downgrading. And keep in mind, Germany is the economic engine of Europe. Politico boldly proclaims that Germany is now the Rust Belt on the Rhine, which I can't say I disagree
Wow,
with some of the headlines that have been coming out of there. Once again,
what a headline!
it it's bold, but for once, I have to give them credit, where it really is the case that you are going to see these furloughed factories in Germany the same way you do see them in places in Middle America and the Great Lakes region. But I, I mean, once again, I will bring up the point that yeah, Germany didn't freeze to death this winter. Yeah, it had enough gas to get through winter. It had enough gas to keep the lights on. Now, that came at the cost of coal plants, and we're talking some of the dirtiest and most unrefined coal that there is in terms of energy production. And we're also talking about the mass exit of industry. So, of course, you're going to have more energy to keep the lights on when you don't need to power the European industrial economy. And, I mean, I do want to bring up this point as well in terms of European energy markets because I think things are going to get worse in terms of European energy, where you're seeing a lot of countries having a renewed interest in nuclear energy. But, and I know I've made this point before, but you have to keep in mind that nuclear energy, I have nothing against it as a concept. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with it. I think some of its advocates like to paint a rosier picture than what really exists, and I think they're being a bit utopian about it. I'll say that much. But ultimately, I think it's a fine source of energy, and that it's a very reasonable thing to pursue. But once again, that doesn't get Europe out of the energy dependence it has on Russia. Because you look at who dominates the global energy market when it comes to nuclear power. You look at the country with the companies that's building the most nuclear power plants at home and abroad. It's the Russians. And
Mhm.
even at this point during the war, they still have reactors that are under construction in Europe. I know Hungary is one in particular. I think even Bulgaria and Slovakia still have Russian reactors that are under construction in their countries. Um, the French import Russian nuclear fuel, and I'll just return to this point. I know I've made it before. If the only the snowball's chance in hell that the Europeans have an energy independence, I'll just put it that way. It's not a high chance, but the only chance they have is if Kazakhstan flips, gets a color revolution government,
Mhm.
and the uranium mines are open there, and nuclear fuel can flow from there. In which case, if Kazakhstan flips, I mean, I know the war in Ukraine has been very precarious for Russia to say the least, but they're ultimately putting a point, and I think we saw this back at the beginning of 2022. they have no choice but to have some level of intervention in Kazakhstan if something like that is to happen, especially with everything that is at stake. Not that I think that will have a color revolution, but it's too crucial to let slip away the way Ukraine did maybe in 2013, 2014. I'll just put it that way. But
Mm.
European energy, and European energy is going to continue to rise. I have very little doubt that future sanctions packages will target nuclear fuel. Now, so far, it has been the it has been the strangest alliance of convenience between France and Hungary when it comes to that. France, Hungary, and a few other disparate European states when it comes to blocking the sanctions on Russian nuclear fuel. But there are elements that are pushing hard for it. And frankly, if this war continues, as animus against Russia grows, I don't find it at all out of their own possibility that they do push this through, that they do completely collapse the European energy industry. Especially, like I said, as this war goes on, the harder it's going to be on Europe, the more that Europe is going to bear the burden of that. I mean, hell, you even had Trump at one of his campaign events saying that the Europeans are going to have to help pay the cost to rebuild Ukraine, which, I mean, just look, I know what to make of that statement given this, but fundamentally, it's just another layer of convolution because we're going to be the ones funding the Europeans because the Europeans are so tightly under our thumb. That's where their economies are being subsidized. At this point, Europe, especially if they were to go through nuclear fuel sanctions, which I know has been a topic of discussion since the beginning of the war, it's going to be a complete American subsidiary at that point. And look, I don't think it's a good thing for either party involved here, but that's the direction it's going down. If there isn't some sort of reconciliation with Russia, which becomes less and less possible every day, and it's also getting inevitable to the point where Europe is probably going to have to start taking harsher economic measures against China as relations between the U.S. and China deteriorate. And I don't think it can really be understated how just screwed Europe is for the foreseeable future, for the indefinite future. I don't see, barring some sort of, barring probably one of the greatest reconciliations you can imagine with Russia, there is no way out of any of this for Europe. It is a continent that has been sentenced to a slow and arduous death. And I know I have been repeating this point since the beginning of this war, but it's one of those things that bears repeating. And I don't think a lot of people, even very intelligent people who I respect very much, understand how much, how screwed Europe is.
Yeah. Yeah, like I wonder even how, because they're trying to forge within Germany like some great military industrial complex, to eventually catch up to the Russians, and similar proposals in Poland.
Well, what is Elon Musk going to send them a bunch of Tesla tanks? Is that the plan to keep them fueled?
Right. Like I don't know how this happens, because that will just create an extra burden on, the average European, the average German. Um, like this is not easy. Like um, the amount of companies that are leaving Germany because of fuel costs, right? Like, I mean, it will have to become very, very subsidized. And who's going to subsidize it? Well, America will.
And
But
let's
can America afford to subsidize?
and let's talk
That
about the
doesn't seem
American
likely
energy.
either.
Let's talk about the American energy industry. Now that you
Yeah.
brought that up. Now, look, I'm not going to pretend like that Joe Biden is single-handedly responsible for killing American energy. He accelerated the process about 3 decades, in my opinion, but it was something with a very limited shelf life. Now, it's come to the point where domestically America, if it wanted to, could produce a healthy amount of energy for itself and even have some left over for exports. But America does not produce enough energy between all energy forms, we're talking, to support both itself and a flailing Europe. That's just simply not possible. It's got to be one or the other. And at this point in the American Empire, they're going to pick the homeland. I mean, for once, they're going to pick the heartland of the American Empire because the situation has gotten that dire. And so there's no excess American energy to ship off to support a European military industrial complex or a military or a European industrial engine, make Germany back into maybe what it was even just 3 years ago. No, that ship has sailed, and it's at the point where, at this point, Europe exists right now in the state it does simply to deprive them from any business with Russia and or China. That's
Mm-hmm.
really all it comes down to.
Yeah.
Europe will be driven further in the ground. The Americans don't even need it, at least to the degree that we have it in terms of the American Empire. It's not vital compared to, let's say, some of the positions we have in the Middle East or East Asia. Europe is probably towards the bottom of that list. But if it means denying a, I don't even want to say a Eurasian landmass because it just gives the wrong idea. But in terms of denying any degree of cooperation between the Europeans and the Russians and or Chinese, oh, it's paramount to keep Europe in this position, keep its head just well. At once I would have said keep its head just barely above the water, but it seems like they're determined to push the head down until Europe stops struggling. That's really what it seems like at this point, and I don't know any other
Mm-hmm.
word to put that in. But that's all I had for the, I guess, obligatory rant about Europe for this episode.
Yeah.
And I'll just close out with just some a point on U.S. domestic news. So, starting off with what's less interesting, heading into 2024, these are the top concerns for the average American. And that would be number one, inflation, affordability of goods and healthcare. Number two, increase in violent crime. Number three, the state of public morality and what's being taught to children. And at number four, which this one is a mainstay, immigration. So you'll actually notice that out of the top four, foreign policy or Ukraine does not fall on that list. And actually taking a look at the list right here, uh, just Pew Research, just usually what you expect, so take it how you will. Just in order, I won't read off the numbers. So I gave you the top four. Um, After that is drug addiction, federal budget, quality of education, climate change, racism, domestic terrorism, infrastructure, international terrorism, unemployment. So something like Ukraine and foreign policy actually doesn't even register on that poll. And like I said, take one poll with a grain of salt, but I did think that was just an interesting microcosm of what we can look at. Now, this is from Reuters saying that the U.S. has all the leading indicators to point to a recession starting soon. Or, as I like to put it, the U.S. has all the leading indicators to point that we're going to admit a recession has already been started. So, just to read verbatim from this Reuters article, just to sum up the point, an index designed to track turns in U.S. business cycles fell for the 15th straight month in June, dragged down by a weakening consumer outlook and increased unemployment claims, marking the longest string of decreases in the lead up since the lead up to the 2007-2009 recession. The conference board on Thursday said its leading economic index, a measure that anticipates future economic activity, declined 0.7% in June from to 106.1. It's not a radio station, don't get your hopes up here. Following a
Mm-hmm.
revised decrease of 0.6 in May, the decline was slightly greater than the median expectation among economists in a Reuters poll for 0.06 decrease, or zero point 0.6 decrease, excuse me. Quote, taken together, June's data suggests economic activity will continue to decelerate in the months ahead, said, oh, this is a hell of a name, Justina Zabinska Lamonica, senior manager of the business cycle indicators at the conference board. The conference board reiterated that forecasts of the U.S. economy is likely to be in recession from the third quarter until the first quarter of 2022. And then Zabinska Lamonica, blah blah blah, said elevated prices, tighter monetary policy, harder to get credit, and reduced government spending are poised to dampen economic growth further. The conference board said contraction of the LEI is accelerating, falling 4.2 over the last 6 months as compared to 3.8 between June and December 22. So I know that is a lot of just economic jargon thrown at you, but really, and look, I'm not pretending like I'm an
Hmm.
expert in economic issues here. Growth indicators are universally down, and
Yeah.
they mimic numbers that we saw in the '08 crisis, but that's also compounded with the fact that while on paper '08 may have been a recovery, when it comes to actual tangible goods, when it comes to what actually matters in terms of a functioning economy, '08 was not a recovery. And that is going to be another '08 recession compounded on the previous one, going further downhill. And of course, once again, to bring it back, the cascading effects, Europe's going to be hit even harder as it was once before, to the point where that continent is just screwed, and even North America and the U.S. in particular is just going to be barely dragging along actual uh, the actual stock of American population that isn't just the radicals in Washington are going to suffer for this. The average person is going to suffer for this. Even the people who are a bit above average, doing well for themselves, are going to suffer for this. Pretty much, the only people that are not going to suffer are the underclasses that uh, who are maybe not politically conscious, but because of their lifestyle and because of the subsidies, are undyingly loyal to the regime in power, and of course the regime elite itself. But the middle and productive classes are going to be the ones who take the heat for this, and that's going to be the case. And it really makes you wonder. Now, look, I'm not saying that we need some sort of like great like wealth equality. I don't have these fantasies, but it does make you wonder how you're supposed to run a functional society without a
Hmm.
functional. Look, I don't like the term working or middle class. I feel like they're a bit antiquated for what we have now, but with a marginalized productive class, I guess I'll call them.
Right, and you can see how they've gradually over the decades have worked against this class, primarily because they see it as the threat, in that it is too independently minded.
I mean, how broken of a socialist system do you have to have where your productive class is the threat? It makes one genuinely wonder what the hell is at play here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you. The fact that they are too independently minded, not that they perfectly agree with everything that's said on the war report, but they certainly are not devout adherents to the state ideology. Maybe some of them are, let's just say, fair weather adherents or easily propagandized, but fundamentally, they aren't the kind of people who are the forefront. They aren't the zealots of this ideology. They aren't the spearhead of the regime, in which case, even as, just speaking purely material terms, even as the most economically productive class, I'm talking anywhere from like just the average worker to maybe somebody who's upper middle class, just is how I would define productive class, just
Hmm.
for just to lay my definitions out on the table, not necessarily like a certain income bracket or a certain line of work, just people who net taxpayers, let's just call them, because that's really what it comes down to, and that can be from really any income bracket, just so long as people who are net contributors to society in material terms, that is. But it's gotten to the point where it really does bring up a debate that I always have with myself. And this is the final point I'll make on this episode of
Mm.
whether we're ruled by cynic opportunists or ideological radicals. To the point where I can only assume that it's a healthy mix of both who are in constant conflict with each other. Because at this point, you figure there would have been, and you do see attempts at this, there would have been some sort of pivot, at least to placate the productive classes in order to maintain some form of this empire. But it seems so far, at least the past 30 years, they are determined to pursue some sort of ideological victory at all costs. Now,
Hmm.
maybe I can't believe I'm saying this. Maybe we'll get lucky and the pragmatic cynics will take over, but I'm not holding out hope for that.
Yeah, I know. You would think, right? Like you would think um, there has to be a rotation of elites, right? Like this has to stop, but I don't see any breaks.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
figured like I know that public opinion has soured on both sides, but I figured at some point they probably would have like tried to play back to the '90s liberalism, the Bill Clinton, Tony Blair type of thing, where it's
mm,
like, oh, we're centrist, center left, blah blah blah, and like try to walk that middle of the road just to get things back on track. So then, in maybe 10 or 15 years, they can continue with the radicalism. But it looks like at this point they're just determined to uh, just throw everything they have at it and trying to obtain victory because they see the windows closing in on themselves. And would some sort of quote unquote moderation be enough to get them on track? I honestly don't know. I do think the situation is far more dire than it was in previous decades, and perhaps that's the reason why they've rejected it. But it really is. I agree with you that there eventually has to be rotation of elites, but what that will look like, I really don't know.
well, I mean, there's two or three things that I think were really unprecedented in the last 3 years, right? So, in the run up to the 2020 election, I have I don't know if this has ever happened. I'm not an expert in American history, but I can tell you in my life, I have never witnessed a promise by three states that if a certain president is reelected, they will secede from the union. And I'm talking about Washington, Oregon, and California. They literally said that,
No, I believe
right?
you, but it
And
just I
remember,
can't help but
like it's
laugh.
easy to forget this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really easy to forget this stuff. But and I forgot it. But it was
Well, I forgot it to the point
happening.
I thought you were saying it again. Like I thought they were threatening this over 2020, but I do remember back in
Oh, I see
2016.
what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The other was Podesta's integrity project that Time magazine bragged
Ugh.
about. Remember he said that. Um, well, I mean later on when let's say voting procedures were not going as people had expected. Uh, there were powerful people connected with Podesta and Podesta himself they were basically telling the Supreme Court, you cannot look at this evidence, and it's badly and as poorly as the case by the Pillow Man was written. Um,
Bringing
the
back
fact
all
of
the
the matter was
classics.
the Supreme Court was never going to look at that, no matter how it was going to be written, right? So that's very unprecedented, right? And then you have January the 6th. And the reason that's allowed to happen is now the precedent has been set for anything remotely even approaching like an authentic coup won't happen because they've said like this fake stupid coup, which was not a coup, is already too far, and nothing of the sort will be tolerated. And then you have the whole diversity thing, and universities, blah blah blah. But guess what? The military, no, the military is not subject to getting relinquishing their diversity laws, I suppose, for lack of a better word at this moment. No, in fact, there was an article that came out in the last few days that's saying, "Don't bother. We can't hire any. Like, we can't train. We need more non-whites in our Air Force." So like you know, either they have like a very fantastical idea about how the future of the empire is going to be, or they're basically worried. They're worried more about radical change happening in America than being challenged by a foreign power.
Oh, absolutely. Which
Because even back then, even in 2020, even in 2021, we were saying this basically indicates that they're not really afraid of a foreign power. They're really afraid of their own population. And that hasn't changed. Because let's face it, America is unassailable. Nobody is going to do anything to America. It's extremely safe. It has the two largest bodies of water separating it from the rest of the world. It has a lot of resources.
As a client
You,
state
you
on
know,
one border, a cartel state on the other border. That's look,
yeah,
look.
yes.
Look. I'm not going to downplay the safety threats that the cartel wars in Mexico could have on Americans, even across the border at this point, especially with the poor border security. But let's be honest, El Chapo and his boys aren't going to be marching into D.C. anytime soon.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, you make that fundamental point that it's unassailable. Like, sure, America's global influence could collapse on itself, but in terms of America as the core American land, that's nothing's going to happen to that. It can't, which is why, once again, they feared some sort of internal change. Even with something as lackluster as the Trump campaign, we saw the way they cracked down on that. So, I mean, I think that
Hmm.
should tell you all you need to know. But one last very important story I think we forgot to cover before I close the show out. We talked about this off
Go
air.
ahead. Yeah.
Obama chef found dead under
No.
mysterious
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yes. 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 The Obama chef.
In which
I don't
case,
know what happened.
I know it's very cruel to do this, but I will save that story for next time because it's so vital. This is what the Democrats and the liberal media do not want you to know. So tune in to the next episode of the War Report to figure out what
He
really
was probably
happened to
killed by a
Obama.
UFO. Just saying.
Oh yeah, fair, fair. Okay, yeah, you're right. I believe every word of the U.S. Congress testimonials because somebody who saw a
Yeah.
UFO gets to testify in front of Congress. A guy who saw a massive surveillance program is living in exile in Russia. You know, look, just don't
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
don't worry about it. Don't ask any more questions about it. But with all that being said, thank you everyone for tuning into another episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thank you and take care.